When we hear the word concubine, many imagine silk gowns, golden jewelry, and a life of endless pleasure inside palaces. The truth is far darker. Imagine being seen not as a human being, but as a possession, a tool of pleasure and politics. That was the reality for countless women in ancient Rome and Greece, hidden behind marble columns and locked chambers. At first glance, their lives looked glamorous. They lived close to emperors, kings, generals, and wealthy elite. They dined at tables filled with exotic fruits and fine wine. They wore perfumes imported from Arabia, their skin covered in the richest oils. Outsiders would look at them with envy, believing they were privileged, chosen, lucky. But this illusion was carefully crafted, because beneath the surface, concubines were trapped. They had no right. They could be gifted, traded, or discarded at a man's whim. Imagine waking up every day knowing your life could be changed, ruined, or ended, not because of your actions, but because of someone else's desire. That wasn't luxury. That was bondage, dressed up in gold. In ancient Rome, concubinage was considered legal, but it was never equal to marriage. A wife had status, children, and recognition. A concubine had only uncertainty. She could never truly claim her place, never guarantee her children's future, and never escape the whispers of being less than. For many, their beauty was their only weapon, but also their greatest curse. And in Greece, the system was no kinder. While society praised the ideal of virtue in women, men maintained harems where concubines were kept for physical pleasure, conversation, and companionship. They lived in rooms decorated with art, music, and luxury, but those walls were also their prison. Their existence was tied to a single man's power, and that power could vanish overnight. The illusion of comfort often fooled even the women themselves. Some entered this life willingly, believing it was a step toward influence and survival. But once inside, they discovered the truth. Their fate was never in their own hands. They could be adored today and replaced tomorrow. Their tears were silence, their choices stripped away. So when history paints the picture of concubines as pampered and privileged, we must look deeper. They were not queens of power, but pawns in a game of control. Their lives remind us of a timeless lesson, that wealth and luxury mean nothing when freedom is stolen. And as we move forward, we'll see how behind the palace walls, beyond the jewels and marble, the real story was written in fear, betrayal, and survival. Step inside the palaces of ancient Rome and Greece, and you'll find something extraordinary. Not just marble halls, golden statues, and roaring feasts, but a world of secrets. Behind those heavy doors, concubines lived at the heart of political game. They weren't simply lovers. They were bargaining chips. They were weapons. They were symbols of power. The truth is, the role of a concubine often stretched far beyond the bedchamber. Some were used to forge alliances between powerful men. A general might gift a concubine to a rival to soften his heart. A ruler might take in the daughter of a foreign noble as a concubine, not out of love, but to secure loyalty. These women were turned into contracts, their bodies signed into history like ink on parchment. But power came with danger. If a concubine became the favorite of a king or emperor, she could wield influence, whispering advice, swaying decisions, even changing the course of wars. Yet that same influence painted a target on her back. Rivals, jealous wives, and other concubines plotted against her. In palaces, beauty wasn't just admired. It was a weapon sharpened against itself. Imagine the silent suffering of living this way, knowing that every smile, every word, every step was being watched. A misplaced glance could spark rumors. A careless word could cost you your life. The concubines who survived longest were those who mastered the art of silence, hiding their true thoughts behind painted lips and downcast eyes. In Rome, some emperors were notorious for the cruelty inflicted on their concubine. One day, a woman might be showered with gifts, golden bracelets, a private villa, even servants of her own. The next, she could be thrown out onto the streets, stripped of everything. Worse still, some faced brutal punishment, accused of betrayal or conspiracy with no proof but envy. In Greece, the silence was no less suffocating. Concubines often lived separated from society, their lives reduced to endless waiting. Waiting for attention, waiting for commands, waiting for freedom that never came. Some sought comfort in art, learning poetry, music, or philosophy, hoping to carve an identity beyond their captivity. But still they remained invisible in the eyes of history. And yet, what makes their suffering most tragic is that many of them believed, or were forced to believe, that this was their destiny, that women were made to endure, to serve, to remain. They had no voice in the records, no chance to write their own truth. Only fragments survive, hidden between the lines of men's stories. Behind palace walls, the lives of concubines reveal a chilling paradox. The closer they were to power, the further they were from freedom. They stood beside rulers who shaped history, but their own names were erased. But what about those who were not known into the palace, but traded into it? What about the women who never had a choice at all, who were bought and sold like cattle? Imagine walking through the bustling marketplaces of Rome or Athens, merchants shouting, coins clinking, the scent of spices and sweat in the air. Among stalls of olive oil, wine, and bronze, another trade took place, the buying and selling of human beings. Concubines were not just chosen, many were purchased, reduced to objects. They were displayed, inspected, and bargained for like livestock. This was the dark economy of desire. Wealthy men wanted beauty, and beauty had a price. Young girls from poor families were often handed over, their parents persuaded that life in a rich man's house was better than poverty. But what seemed like an opportunity was often a trap. Once taken, these women were no longer daughters, they were property. In Rome, concubinage existed alongside slavery. Some concubines were slaves elevated to special status, while others were free women forced into relationships by financial desperation. In both cases, the outcome was the same. Their bodies became currency. And unlike wives, concubines had no legal shield. If a man tired of them, he simply dismissed them, sometimes leaving them destitute. In Greece, the system was equally cruel. Concubines were sometimes captives of war, women torn from their homes, their families slaughtered, their futures stolen. Soldiers brought them back as trophies, gifts for generals or bargaining chips for kings. Imagine the terror of a young woman, captured in battle, knowing she was not heading into chains, but into a gilded prison where her identity would be erased. What made it even more painful was the illusion of choice. Some concubines appeared to live better than ordinary women, dressed well, housed luxuriously, fed lavishly. But underneath that veneer lay the truth. They had no say in their fate. They could not choose their partner, their freedom, or even their children's future. They were kept, not loved. And let's not forget the children. Sons of concubines in Rome often lived in limbo, neither fully recognized as heirs, nor entirely dismissed. Daughters, meanwhile, could be forced into the same cycle as their mothers, sold off to continue the chain of possession. Generations of women lived and died in silence, remembered only as attachments to powerful men. The price of desire was always paid in suffering. For men, concubinage was entertainment, a symbol of wealth and dominance. For women, it was a sentence, a life defined not by who they were, but by what they could offer. But where there is trade, there is competition. And in the palaces of Rome and Greece, rivalry among concubines could turn deadly. Their lives were not only controlled by men, but also endangered by one another. Because in a world where survival meant being the favorite, every smile could hide a nut. Imagine a world where every glance was a competition, every whispered word a potential threat, every smile a mask. This was the reality of concubines living inside the palaces of Rome and Greece. Their survival wasn't just about pleasing the man in power, it was about outlasting the others trapped in the same gilded cage. In Rome, emperors often kept multiple concubines. To be the favorite meant safety, wealth, and influence. But to fall out of favor meant humiliation, exile, or worse. Women who once shared laughter and secrets quickly became enemies. Alliances formed and shattered in an instant. A misplaced word, a rumor spread, or a calculated betrayal could topple a rival overnight. And when jealousy took root, the results were deadly. Concubines accused one another of poisoning, of seduction, of treason. Sometimes these accusations were true. More often, they were weapons forged out of desperation. Imagine the fear of knowing that the woman sitting beside you at dinner might be plotting your downfall, that every gift, every gesture, could hide a trap. In Greece, the situation was equally ruthless. Harems became battlegrounds, where women competed not only for attention, but also for survival. Some cultivated talents, learning music, dance, or poetry to stand out. Others relied on cunning, using gossip and manipulation to eliminate rivals. The palace was less a home and more a chessboard, with every concubine as a piece waiting to be sacrificed. History gives us chilling glimpses of these rivalries. Some concubines plotted directly against queens and empresses, hoping to replace them. Others became pawns in larger political schemes, manipulated by powerful men who used their jealousy as fuel for palace intrigue. In the end, very few won. The majority were discarded, silenced, or erased once they ceased to be useful. The emotional toll was immense. Imagine living in constant fear, knowing that one wrong move could end your life. Trust became impossible. Friendships, rare. Love, a dangerous illusion. The only certainty was that survival demanded constant vigilance, and even then, fate was rarely kind. And yet, amidst these rivalries, a haunting truth remains. Most of these women left no record of their voices, only traces written by others. Their stories became shadows twisted into tales of seduction, scandal, or betrayal, never of humanity, suffering, or strength. But what about those hidden stories? The ones history deliberately buried? What about the concubines who dared to resist, who found ways to endure, or whose lives reveal the resilience of women trapped in impossible circumstance? History, as we know it, is written by men. Kings, generals, philosophers, and poets filled the pages, while the women who lived beside them were silenced. Concubines, in particular, rarely left behind their own work. Yet, if we look closely at scattered fragments, we catch whispers of their lives, whispers that defy the silence. Take ancient Rome, for instance. The historian Tacitus mentions the women in emperors' circles only in passing, often painting them as schemers or temptresses. But behind these accusations lies another possibility. Women forced to play dangerous roles simply to survive. When we strip away the bias of the male gaze, we see not villains, but victims trapped in an unforgiving system. And in Greece, the voices of concubines are even fainter. The philosophers who praised virtue in women rarely acknowledged the existence of those kept in harems. Yet, occasionally, a poem or inscription reveals their humanity. A few lines of longing, a verse of sorrow, a prayer etched on a piece of pottery. These fragments are not the voices of seductresses. They are the cries of women who wanted to be remembered. Some stories did survive, though often twisted. For example, the concubines who dared to wield influence were branded dangerous. Roman gossip painted them as manipulators whispering in emperors' ears. Greek myths demonized women who defied their place, casting them as sirens or witches. By demonizing them, society justified their suffering. By erasing their humanity, history preserved only the caricature. But imagine the reality. Imagine a young woman stolen from her homeland, learning a new language, hiding her grief behind a painted face. Imagine her teaching herself music, not for pleasure, but as a shield to stand out in a sea of rivals. Imagine her comforting another concubine in whispers at night, knowing their friendship might cost them their lives. These stories, though invisible in the records, are written in the silence of history. And still, some concubines did shape history, though their names remain faint. A favorite who convinced an emperor to show mercy. A woman who used her position to protect her children. A concubine who secretly aided philosophers or passed on knowledge forbidden to her. They remind us that even in chains, human beings resist erasure. The tragedy is that their voices were not lost by accident. They were deliberately buried. The powerful had no interest in preserving the words of women who could expose their cruelty. So, their stories became invisible, like footprints washed away by the tide. But if we listen closely, if we read between the lines, their truth emerges. Concubines were not just objects of desire. They were daughters, mothers, thinkers, survivors. Their forgotten voices remind us of the cost of silencing half of humanity. And this silence forces us to ask a final, haunting question. What does their legacy mean for us today? What can the fate of concubines teach us about power, freedom, and the dangers of forgetting? The story of concubines in ancient Rome and Greece is not just a tale of the past. It's a mirror reflecting timeless truths about power, desire, and human dignity. Their suffering was not confined to centuries long gone. It carried lessons that echo through every age. In Rome, concubinage was most visible during the imperial era, from the 1st century BCE to the 4th century CE. Emperors like Augustus, 27 BCE, 14 CE, formalized the practice, distinguishing concubinage from marriage, yet keeping it legally recognized. Later rulers, such as Nero, 54-68 CE, and Commodus, 180-192 CE, became infamous for their cruelty toward the women in their palaces. Concubines lived at the very heart of the empire, close to men who shaped laws, commanded armies, and expanded borders, yet they themselves had no control over their fate. In Greece, long before Rome's rise, the system was entrenched in the classical period, 5th, 4th century BC. Wealthy Athenians, while praising ideals of virtue and citizenship, maintained households of concubines and slaves. Xenophon, the historian and philosopher, wrote openly about the roles of concubines, describing how they were for daily attendance and pleasure, a line that reduces human beings to nothing more than objects of service. For many of these women, especially those captured in wars like the Peloponnesian conflict, 431-404 BCE, their identities were stripped away the moment they were taken. The legacy they leave is one of warning. They remind us that luxury without freedom is an illusion, that power, when unchecked, will always consume the vulnerable first, that a society can rise to greatness in art, politics, and philosophy, yet still build that greatness on the silent suffering of women. Concubines lived in shadows, yet their experiences shine a harsh light on the fragility of human rights. They show us how quickly dignity can be bought, sold, or erased. When a person is seen as an object, and those centuries have passed, their lesson feels urgent today. Whenever power is concentrated in the hands of a few, the voices of the weak are in danger of being silenced. Their pain also carries a message of resilience. Despite being forgotten, erased, or demonized, their existence still forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How do we honor lives that history chose to bury? How do we prevent the same silence from falling over others in our own time? The truth is, the fate of concubines is not just history. It is a reminder that freedom is fragile, that silence is dangerous, and that we must give voice to those the world tries to erase. And so, the dark fate of concubines in ancient Rome and Greece becomes more than a tragic story. It becomes a call to remember, to reflect, and to fight for a world where no life is treated as possession and no voice is lost to history. The story of concubines in ancient Rome and Greece isn't just a dark chapter of history. It's a mirror that reflects the dangers of unchecked power and forgotten voices. These women lived close to rulers who shaped empires, yet they were denied even the smallest freedom. Their lives remind us that behind every marble statue and golden crown, there were human beings whose stories were silenced. If their voices moved you, let's make sure they're never erased again. Share their story, keep the memory alive, and help more people discover the hidden truths of history. If you found this video powerful, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the untold past. Together, we'll keep uncovering the shadows history tried to hide.